Greetings and welcome to the ICT Hub's new webinar within our Innovation Space series that discusses innovative business approaches, how to transform companies, changing the organizational mindset, and enhancing relations with customers. Less than a week from now, on Wednesday 28th, we will be hosting a second day of the online corporate innovation conference with the main topic of designing innovation. Where we'll dive deep into tools and methodologies that can help us reach innovation faster and reduce risk. My name is George Georgievich, and I am a business designer at ICT Hub. And today we're going to talk about how can companies create a solid, foolproof systems that can lead to successful innovation efforts, but also how this process is often full of obvious obstacles. Therefore, our title for today is Overlooking the Obvious. Innovation is painful, expensive, but worth it. I'm very excited to announce our guest that is joining us straight from the Silicon Valley, John Carter, a widely respected expert on product development. He is an inventor of Bose's noise-canceling headphones and designer of Apple's new product process. As a founder of TCGen, a Silicon Valley-based consulting firm, he has worked with Amazon, Apple, Cisco, HP, IBM, Mozilla, and many other big companies. He has helped companies cut time to market, rapidly scale their product program, and improve innovation with customer insights, helping to increase profitability, reduce costs, and improve customer satisfaction. John is also a co-author of a book called Innovate Products Faster, which is available on Amazon. John, hello and welcome. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. We are thrilled to have you. And we are really looking forward to hearing your presentation for today, and maybe even more looking forward for the presentation next week on our conference. How are you doing?
Very good, and thank you so much for inviting me this afternoon. As Georgie said, I'm phoning in or zooming in here from Menlo Park in Silicon Valley. And I just love this opportunity to share some of my experience with you this morning or this afternoon for you. Unfortunately, my native language is not Serbian, and when I was in high school, I took French. So I'm not able to converse with you in Serbian, but I'll do my best in English and hope you can understand.
We'll have time, enough time for until next week, I guess.
Yeah, okay, exactly. I will take the speed learning course.
Yes.
You might judge from the title of this presentation that it's all about something that's very hard and difficult. For example, if you look at a typical situation presented at a conference or a webinar like this, the host will describe to you how easy it is to do innovation. And if you just follow this process 1, 2, 3, you'll be able to be very successful and innovate tomorrow. Other presenters often describe, well, this is what we did. And from this one success that we had, we can generalize, and therefore, if you follow this, you'll be successful too. Well, I have the benefit of being in the industry as chief engineer of Bose and CTO and other roles, as well as consulting to companies such as Apple and Amazon and Cisco and many others, medium and small size too. So I'm able to combine the two. Combine the real life experience and then combine what I've seen across companies that makes them successful. So although the title is Don't Look the Obvious, Innovation is Painful and Expensive, what I plan to do this afternoon for you is talk really about fundamentally how you can achieve innovation. I'll give you at least a playbook that I've seen work for me, work for many companies, and produce really great results. It's not, though, an overnight story. It requires some discipline, and I'll describe that in just a minute. So if you look at a couple of the companies that I've worked with, these are two that I've had some very close experience. They happen both to be in consumer electronics, although these experiences can be generalized from financial services, insurance, med tech, etc. And that is in working up close at Apple, where I was involved in the development of the new product process. I was able to see across the product divisions there how they innovate and what's true and what's not true. And there's a lot of myths around Apple that have been written that are simply not true, but many things are true. And the culture that produces innovation is one that is relentless and scales. And I've seen it work. And in part, the reason it works is because of consistency. And I'll talk about that in a minute. I've also got a story about Bose. Bose is another company where I worked. I was chief engineer there, involved, as Dorji said, for the development, invention, and development of the noise canceling headphones. And we also had a culture of innovation. It turns out both these companies had iconic founders. We had Steve Jobs and Dr. Amar Bose, who are both incredible product people. And I think that's part of it. But really, it's not the full story. And I think Steve Jobs' weight is overblown, as you've seen from the company continued to grow and innovate and move forward. But nevertheless, this is not about people. But first, I thought I'd talk about something really important to set the stage for you, because if I don't do this, you may not understand fully the meaning of what I'm about to say. And that is, there's a big difference between small I and big I. So if we talk about often things that are presented in conferences, they're about small I innovations, small but important improvements that move the business forward. On the other hand, when I speak about innovation, I'm speaking about capital I innovation. What do I mean by that? Very simply, I mean that innovation is discontinuous. It is disruptive. It's a large change. Improvements can be small change. Second, innovation has to make an impact. In other words, the change has to be material and felt by a lot of people, either customers or employees or shareholders, but it has to make an impact. And the third quality, which I think is important, that impact has to be financial. So improvements are all the things that are good and will help your business be more successful and help your work be more productive. All good things and all things that are going to move the progress of a company forward and do every day. I'm not talking about those things today. I'm talking about innovation. And I'm talking about really game-changing innovation. And I think if you look at innovation, it actually boils down to three very simple elements. It's not complicated. So it's hard to execute, but in principle, it's not very complicated. And what I describe and what I'd like to convey to you this afternoon is that these three components have to do with leadership and governance, i.e. how the innovation process is run. It has to do with funding, and I'll give you some benchmarks for what I think appropriate capital I innovation funding is. And the third thing you do need is process. And I want to emphasize the process of discovery and of protected spaces when we talk about innovation. So if we look at innovation, it is really a protected space surrounded by funding, surrounded by leadership, and enabled by process. Those are the three things.
Excuse me for interrupting. Can you just reshare your presentation because we cannot see it currently?
Oh, well, thank you for letting me know. It didn't change on my end. Let me know if it's now visible.
Not
Nope.
yet.
Let me try this.
It works.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
you bet. Let me just get this properly set up here. So, and thank you for pointing that out. The presentation wasn't showing. Please don't wait. Anyway, as I was saying, there are the three components: governance or leadership, process or a way to create a protected space and discover what your customers like about your innovation, and funding. This requires material funding. This is not make something from nothing. And this is part of the reason why it's painful and expensive. So more than anything, though, it requires patience. Innovation takes a long time. And if you look at the case of the Bose noise canceling headphones, it was fully 5 years before we came out with a product. Not 1, not 2, not 3, but 5. And so it really takes time, and therefore it takes patience. But it's also, and I'll stress these again, is it requires focus. It requires the skills. You have to have the top quality human resources. And then it also requires consistent funding on a yearly basis for many, many, many years. So the notion is, if you can do these three things and stick with it, you will be successful, and you'll be successful with capital I innovation. I might say, though, that culture can kill it. So it's also important that we treat every idea as fragile and we nurture it accordingly. It ultimately needs to be tested, but early in its life cycle, an idea is very fragile. So let's talk about these three components. The first component, governance or leadership, is essential. And I recommend, and I've seen this work, that companies apply a concept borrowed from Silicon Valley, which is to create an internal venture board. This venture board has the right, meaning across the key subsets of engineering, marketing, operations, quality, etc., to really oversee a product development effort. And in general, I'm talking about innovations in product development. They don't have to be, and I'll describe a couple as we go on, but I'm using that as a focal point for this particular talk about how to really sustain innovation. This governance team needs to be high level, and its goal is not to create roadblocks for teams, but to break them down. The idea is that they are an enabler and they serve the teams. The second thing you need is investment. This is not cheap. It doesn't come for free. There are lots of failures. Innovation is expensive. And you have to establish a yearly budget level. And I know for many of you who are not working at corporate, this would have to be done on a regional or distributed level, which is just fine. But you need to make sure that you have funding allocated to your unit, whatever that is for innovation. And I recommend making it large enough so you can really get a cauldron where teams interact and they benefit from each other, and you develop your innovation muscles. And third is, I like to say that use the least process possible, but no less. Meaning you should have really a system that does three things. First, it intakes ideas. So you have a system to pull out ideas from the organization and from outside partners and other schools, academics, wherever innovation is taking place. You need a process that the venture board oversees this mechanism of innovation. And this needs to be defined, what the rules of engagement are, what their roles and responsibilities. It's not complicated, but needs to be defined. And then finally, you need a process to transfer to development or to scale. Many ideas are often just as challenged in the initial concept as they are when they try and scale. The first thing I'd like to talk about when we talk about the nuts and bolts of innovation is you need some kind of product vision, or more generally, a vision. In other words, what it is that you do. And this vision is important for three reasons. It's important because it enables informed decisions. It encourages explicit alignment between the vision and what you plan to do. And finally, it frames the trade-offs around proposed products. How well does this product satisfy the vision versus this? And you can see from these examples at Amazon, Panagonia, and IKEA, they're very clear statements about what the company is and isn't, and what the company wants to do, both from its shareholders and profit standpoint, but also in terms of environmental, green, social, all the other factors. And you can see in the case of these visions, they are expansive, but they also define what business these companies are in. A venture board is like a steering committee, but it's really the executives over product, which typically would be engineering, development, maybe QC, maybe user experience, marketing, sales, engineering, marketing, and sales, and then certainly some financial role. This board needs to be able to budget and defend ongoing investment. It's material. And as I mentioned, they need to be servant leadership. They need to serve these innovation teams because they'll have many challenges, both internally and from the organization. But what it's not is this is not a board where you get status updates from the teams all the time, or you're trying to reach in and help them. We like to say it's fingers in, hands out. In other words, have an arm's distance relationship. This is not a waterfall process. The focus is on removing obstacles, and it's not a product review board. This is really an innovation enhancer and enabler. One of the things that this venture board can help create, what's this notion of a protected space. And so the idea is that we have essentially these agile teams, small innovation teams that are full stack, meaning they have all the technical disciplines necessary to do the core demonstration of the new product idea or new capability. Typically working in an agile fashion, and here's what's most important, is working in discovery. In other words, making sure that you don't delay the contact of the innovation and the customer. I can tell you from my experience at Bose, we waited almost 3 years before ever showing an early model to a customer. And we could have done it sooner. We would have learned so much. The most important thing that we learned is that inventors don't often know what the true benefits consumers will hold for their products. And so when we invented it, we thought the headphones could in fact produce better sound, better music, better speech. But what we found is that what people cared about was noise cancellation. So here we created a product that was really initially intended to make things sound better. But what it actually did, and what consumers told us, was that what they liked about it is it made things quiet. And so this whole notion of having a protected space where teams can agilely interact with customers and get feedback is very important and protected from the bureaucracy of the organization. You can create virtual firewalls, which is so easy now to do in times of COVID, by actually taking the innovation teams off the company email and off the company Slack. So you create a virtual skunkworks. Let's talk about investment, because as we've said, innovation is painful and expensive. What is it going to take? Well, here in Silicon Valley, as companies grow, they need funding because they don't yet have enough revenue to cover their costs. And these fundings often occur in 3 or 4 stages, starting with seed and ending with Series B or Series C. And you can see the investments increase. What I'm talking about is creating in your company, essentially, a venture capital organization with its portfolio companies. And so the companies in working on innovation and the funding to pay their salaries is early stage. And the idea is what you're trying to do is in this discovery period, go through seed, pre-seed and seed rounds, where you're really trying to test the product market fit and begin to get some indication of the business model. Those are the most important things that you need to do early on. And you need money to do this. So you can see, if you just look at these calculations, looking at a yearly 12-month budget, about $10 million a year would fund 3 seed innovations and 1 to 2 Series innovations, Series A innovations. Series A innovations are much more expensive because they're later stage. So the notion is that this funding would be able to cover a small handful of projects and be enough to do that each and every year. So you need some pool. These are Silicon Valley numbers, and so may be inflated for your environment, but they give you some sense of scale. Another way of looking at scale is you can look at the investment for professionals, which you might want to invest $1 million, 1% of your revenues, or 10% if you're in the product development arena. 1/10 of your development budget should be allocated towards innovation. So it is painful and is expensive because it takes a long time and it's fragile. But on the other hand, it's important you don't overlook the obvious, which is the real benefits of this capital I innovation that I've talked about here, is to lead market position. You can lead sales and profit and lead growth. So there are many studies that have looked at your particular market position as it relates to innovation. Almost always innovators are first to market. And have a top market share. The second is they lead sales and profit. The reason they lead sales and profit is because better implies different, not the other way around. Better implies different, not the other way around. And what does that mean? That means to be better, you have to be different. To be different, you have to invest, you have to really innovate, and you have to scale. But if you do that, then what you've done is you've produced a product that stands out in the marketplace and has a reason for being. And therefore you can charge more for the product because customers are more willing to spend that because of these greater benefits that the product has. So it leads to profit and it leads to sales. So another great benefit. And the third thing, and this is so important to growing companies, and that is how to attract talent. If you're growing at 30% a year, you will double every 3 years. Providing that kind of growth in the company provides growth opportunities for employees. And this is a great way to, actually, a great benefit of innovation, which is continued growth, rapid growth, which means continued hiring, which means you attract and retain the very best people. You can look at some of the results in Silicon Valley. This list of companies, these 5 companies, are drawn from this area, and they're all unicorns, which means they're privately held. You can't buy the stock yet. And they're worth, in valuation, $1 billion or more. Now, it turns out that the 5 companies on this page are worth from $16 billion to $46 billion. And these are examples in their own categories: SpaceX and space transportation, DoorDash and food delivery, restaurant delivery, Stripe and payments, Airbnb and leisure and entertainment, Instacart in shopping and convenience, that these companies have innovated in very major ways. And so the notion that you can be innovative and really deliver to your shareholders, to your customers, to your employees, true differentiation without investment and without time and effort and consistency, patience, is a fool's errand. But on the other hand, if you plan to do it, you can really reap rewards for yourself and for the company and for your customers. So with that, I'd like to thank you. And I think George is going to ask me some questions now.
Thank you so much, John. A lot of interesting topics that you've covered, and a lot of things that we see when working with our clients that are very symptomatic and can lead to results. But people are overlooking the obvious quite frequently, actually. So we already have one question from the audience. I might jump straight to that. You talked about the capital I innovation. However, if there is a need to convince the managers, the decision makers, do you have anything in place for quick wins from your experience? Something that is foolproof and that can help get on board the decision makers once they see a concrete success?
Never seen it. No.
Why Christmas?
Innovation is painful and expensive. The fact of the matter is that and it goes back to the principle of what innovation is all about. So I'm sorry I don't have a good answer about quick wins. I've never seen it. And that is that in order to really produce something that's a breakthrough, it means it's never done before. And that means you actually have to put in effort to do so. And you need really smart people. I don't know a shortcut around that. Now, you might say, and this might be one way around it, is through mergers and acquisitions. In other words, you might be able to identify, absorb, and capitalize on an innovation company that has already created its idea and proven it. So you're grabbing it at a later point in its life cycle at lower risk. So that is the only way that I can think of shortcutting the innovation process with a quick win is by M&A.
Definitely, that was one of my questions that I actually wanted to ask you. So when we think about innovation and the development process of innovative products, and there's a lot of confusion with the companies, whether should we do this internally or externally, and what is there a fine lining? Where is that border? How do we determine when we need to include external teams such as startups, or maybe acquire them through an M&A, or maybe just enter some other form of cooperation with them? Do you have some sort of metrics for that? When do we know? How do we know that we actually need an external partner, or that we need to jump into some sort of partnership or an M&A?
Great question. And I think the way it started here was with some of the original work done on this by GE. And basically what they look at is, if they want to outsource something, can they find a lower cost solution, and is it not strategic? If it's strategic, they don't outsource it. And therefore, if the core activities of your innovation And not all activities are core, but if the core activities are not in your company, you need to have a plan to acquire them so they are part of your company. So therefore, I think it's actually pretty easy. And this goes back to your product vision. What parts of that innovation team are aligned with your product vision and support that? Those you need to do inside, or be able to acquire and hire, buy or hire other individuals. You need to be able to do that fundamentally. And if you can't do that, then you need to rethink your strategy. But it's not black or white, because partners can be used to augment the team, provide additional resources, to provide specialization, QA. There's a whole bunch of other reasons that you could use partnership, but not for the core invention. You can use it to help it scale.
Thank you. Now that you mentioned strategy, and I just wanted to take a step back and talk a bit about what you mentioned at the very beginning, those three key elements: governance, funding, and process. So what is the importance of having a well-founded strategy that determines these three key pillars? And how does it stream from the strategy, that whole process, or not?
Yeah, well, one would argue that everything comes from strategy and leadership. I think in our case, in general, the strategy has to implicitly, meaning in broad outline, support innovation. Doesn't need to explicitly, although that would be nice. But what is important is that if you think about strategy, a great way to picture it for innovations involving new products and new services, whether it be financial or physical products, it doesn't matter, is that if you think about what is really going to move the needle, you're going to need to really invest in this heavily. And these investments really need to be local and within the company. And therefore, you have to consider these factors when thinking about, different ways of making sure it happens. Strategy provides the umbrella. So it's the frame under which you really think about it. And strategy, if you also include budgeting and product portfolio, completely determines the innovation map. Because if your strategy also says, well, of our investments, we're going to invest 60% of our activities in, let's say, adjacent products or core products. We're going to invest maybe 30% in incremental improvements or derivative products, and then 10% of our portfolio will be in innovative products. That basically says everything, because once you have the strategy, you have the product vision. Once you have the product vision and the strategy, you create a portfolio. A portfolio then maps out the investment that you plan to make in these more risky activities. And so this, I think, is a really good point in terms of strategy. In terms of strategy, if you think about strategy is the one great thinker said that strategy is just the direction to marshal resources. So it basically helps you apply your resources. Resources are budget. So if you think about strategy and you then think about a portfolio, you naturally think about, well, how do I allocate our innovation resources? Most are going to be, if you will, towards incremental improvement or core. And so how much do you want to allocate on the transformational innovations? And that's where strategy can definitely be useful there and in the product vision.
Quick follow-up question. Once a company has determined that innovation and is very crucial for them, and they determine even some of the elements of how reaching innovation, but sometimes there's still misalignment with what's actually going on and with the strategy, whether it's due to a lack of real vision or lack of support or sponsorship from the key stakeholders. But how do you, have you ever experienced something like that, where a company actually has identified in their strategy that innovation is important, even identified some of the key pillars and steps of how to achieve it, but still in practice something does not work?
Yeah, okay. A very common problem. And unfortunately, it's a hard problem to solve. And you see this a lot in larger companies, middle size and larger, where the top executives want to do a certain thing. And there's good alignment. And then the managers in the middle they're working on different things and they have different alignments. And these managers control people. And so if they're not aligned fully on this vision, then the middle managers, the people managers, may not be on board. So one thing that we've done, and I'd recommend you consider, is to create a separate innovation organization. I wouldn't call it innovation. I'd call it discovery or some other name that's neutral, because you want innovation to happen everywhere. But this is a dedicated team who's working on those risky, far out ideas. And they report to a manager who has received a budget for those people. So they're not having to borrow people. And so key to really fixing the problem that you describe is to create a dedicated organization. Now that creates walls between that dedicated organization and the managers who were left out because they didn't get to participate in this. But those problems have different solutions and can be solved more easily.
We've also seen quite a lot of opposite situations where actually there are innovation teams, innovation boards, but there is no strategy that actually determines the priority level of innovation. So I think that goes both ways.
Yeah, it does. And I would tend to argue this is a generalization. When that's happening, you have a lot of small I innovation, because these small regional boards don't really have enough financial muscle to invest. But I've seen that problem too. You're right. It's both ways.
Yes. So you mentioned product vision, and in your book, you're talking about product strategy. How is product strategy or product vision, how are they related, and how are they both related to innovation strategy? So what are the differences, and how do we align them, and how do we tell them apart?
It's a really good question. And there's not an easy answer, but I'll do the best I can. So when I think about product strategy, I think about the very broad principles. For example, are we known like Mercedes and Apple to be the best product, but most expensive? So our product strategy is to do luxury brands with the best innovations. Or it might be like LVMH in consumer luxury that, wants to create this appeal of luxury and comfort and so forth. And they have their product position and pricing. Or you could be like Amazon, which is, customer service and fair prices and everything. That could be your market position. Or you could be a fast follower. So you could copy things, but do it quickly. Or you could be just flat the low cost producer. And so these I would call in general product strategies. What a product vision is, and I think it's really important, is it's more about what you are and how you differ from other people and others in your relative space. And the second is it should be useful and specific enough so you can use that as an easy gauge to figure out if your products are aligned. I'll give you a great example. Very simple. So Bose was in the speaker and audio area, consumer electronics. And we had a couple of very simple rules. One was big sound from small packages. Okay, so that and already gives constraints. And the other is great bass. Okay, so you think about these two things, they're very, very simple, but actually they give teams, managers, just about everybody a clear idea of what the company's about and what's aligned with the product vision. Product strategy is more general, tells you how you compete and what your position is. And then the product vision is what do you uniquely do and how do you exceed?
You mentioned also that we need to big eye innovation has to be disruptive. It has to make an impact. It has to be material, but the impact has to be financial. A lot of companies are actually innovating just because it's trendy, because they want to have a good PR out of it, and not really focusing on real objectives and solving the business needs, the business issues, the challenges they have identified, or really putting new innovative products on the market. So how important is aligning the product vision with the business strategy and goals?
Well, I think it's very important. You mentioned several things, and by the way, there are a couple of participant questions we should get to next. But if you think about really getting alignment through the organization, I think it's how strategy is deployed. In other words, how the top vision gets actually mechanized. And the Japanese had a system called Hoshin Kanri, or policy deployment, but it's basically a way in which you make sure that everybody has a clear line of sight to the vision. And the problem that you describe, either that's a marketing thing where you try and attract people by saying you have an innovative culture, which is not true, but you just do it for recruitment. I mean, that to me is a whole other issue. But if you've got misalignment between, let's say, and this commonly happens, where they say risk is tolerated, but when people fail, it's the end of their career. So, and that's, I see very commonly. And then you have a misalignment between, almost culturally. In other words, if we're going to support innovation, we have to support failure. And we have to show it by how people are treated when they fail.
I think that's very relevant, especially for our market, as the mentality and culturally speaking, failure is often seen in a very bad way. So we might come back to that later. Let's get some of the questions from the audience. So Amra is thanking for an interesting presentation, and she is asking, has the process of innovation changed in the global pandemic?
So this is a good question, and the research is still out. I'm going to say it's yes and no. And I'm going to say that, and this is from observation, and I'm on the board of a company, and so I get to really observe how they work, that by and large, small I innovation is decreased. In other words, the casual kind of, hey, that's a great idea, or, I just thought of this, that kind of, which is great. And I think really everybody should be encouraged to do that constantly. That I think will suffer. I think there's just the mechanism of that is so social that will suffer. Big I innovation, I don't think is going to suffer, because now there are exceptions when you can't go to your laboratory or whatever. But aside, if it's knowledge work where you don't need facilities, then I would say that big I innovation is going to do just fine. It may do better because people are more isolated and more focused. But the fact is, in big I innovation, you have groups or you have teams, it's their job, and so they continue that job. They're not so on small I innovation influenced by meeting in the hallway.
I think that a lot of companies actually realize the importance of the capital I innovation during this pandemic.
Right. So we need it.
Second question is something that we get quite often here in Serbia. A lot of people trying to start something of their own startup or a fast-growing company. And this question is if you have any advice for young people that are trying to create something truly innovative with the capital I, are they in a worse position to do so than big companies? So it's a really wide actually question. I believe the answer to.
No, I think it's a great question, and I'm glad that Jovan asked it. And you started off with the solution in your line of questions to me, Georgie, and that was that if you look at the most important thing is alignment. So here you've got a great idea. You've got some young person with a really terrific idea. The usual problem and challenge that young person has is they're in an environment where that idea is not appreciated. And the most likely reason it's not appreciated is the CEO or the leader or the manager doesn't see how that idea is aligned with strategy and the product vision. So the challenge for a young inventor, and this is a really good question, the first thing you got to do is you've got to find a company. You've either got to start your own company, or you've got to find a company where what you do, what your idea is central and vital to them. Not it makes things a little better for many companies, or you could use this in so many situations, but rather you need to find a company where that idea would unlock their strategic achievement. And the friction is that people come up with ideas, they're from everywhere, and they're not always aligned with the company vision. So what do? You've got a great idea, but you're not aligned with the vision. Well, I think you've got to get yourself either another idea that is aligned with the vision, or you got to change the company, because the other strategy is hope, and hope is not a strategy.
That's a great quote. Hope is not a strategy. So I would like to go back to the concept of protected space. Working with the large corporates in our region, we've noticed that a lot of innovative efforts are being stopped in their tracks by procurement and a lack of innovation accounting. So once we create a protected space, maybe isolated from the rest of the company, but sometimes that is not always possible for a lot of organizations to create a separate entity that would be completely isolated from the bureaucracy of the large organization. So what is your advice to companies that do not have that luxury? How can they create their protected space within their organization?
Okay. These are really good questions. And my first answer is it's a fool's errand. They can't. In order to get capital I innovation, you have to create this kind of area, organization, permission for innovation to occur. And this is another important myth. This is why it's painful and expensive, is that you probably have to invest the equivalent of, 3 salaries for 3 years. Now, that's a real significant investment. And how are you going to make that without a dedicated team? Well, you could try and distribute it, but the problem, as you state, is in fact, well, how do you get those people to focus on it? And we can do the accounting, that can be estimated or tracked or whatever. But the real issue is, can they really get the time? Because this notion of 20% time, which was invented by 3M, not Google, is crazy. It's fantasy. It's a dream. And you don't get capital I innovation. You may get small I innovation. So the challenge you suggest is real. And the only way that I can suggest you approach it maybe is to approximate a dedicated organization by having a matrix where you have strong innovation team leaders who are accountable for delivering on innovation, and then they pull the resources from the managers and have them focus on innovation. So you might be able to do it with a small number of dedicated innovation, let's say project managers or scrum masters or something like that. That might be a hybrid.
Great. We have four more questions that came from the audience through our Q&A form. So the first one is, considering that it takes 3 years for innovative product, are there any indicators that can show us that our innovation is not on a good path? I think it deals with metrics.
Yeah, it does. It does. A good question. It's a good question. So usually there's a common way of thinking of it, which is a good starting point. The usual way you think of it is that regular development, product development can be schedule driven. You can say, we're going to do this by this date, even if it's agile, we've got these major releases and we schedule it out. Innovation can't be scheduled. So you can't measure it by time, the way you'd normally measure achievement by dates. But what you can do is you can measure expense and you can measure milestones. So the classic way that innovation is managed is by investment and milestones versus more riskless, risk-free processes, which you can actually schedule and see the project. So the best metric for innovation probably is milestone achievement and budget.
Thank you. The next question is also regarding the pandemic, and which industry do you think will need the biggest amount of time to recover from 2020? And in comparison, do you think there was a corporate giant who mapped the second or third horizon just right so they can make the crisis work for them?
Well, sure. Yes. Zoom. This company that we're talking on was perfect storm. Cisco had WebEx, Microsoft had Teams, you had Skype, you had Google Hangouts, probably Facebook, you had like 20 solutions with Zoom because it was easy to use. Absolutely, that's the case. So I think that there's no doubt about that.
And what about what industries will have the biggest will need the biggest amount of time to recover?
Yeah, I think that's all the usual suspects, which is that all the discretionary travel and leisure went away. In fact, the best economic description I've heard of this is really simple. And that is what has happened is that we have gone from spending on services now to spending on goods. In other words, we don't take vacations, we don't get massages, don't get our hair cut, whatever. So the service economy is gone. And so I think it's service, travel and leisure, and other industries related to being face-to-face that are going to suffer. And I think some things like businesses, like Twitter, you can work away from the office forever. There's going to be some permanent changes that aren't going to bounce back, but it's anything related to service, travel.
Thank you. So another question from Ivan Grigorievich. Do you believe that companies should have outside innovation consultants like a coach to a top player, or that should happen exclusively within teams? And in addition, should this be limited to strategy?
I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to this. With regard to outside help, it can be useful, it can be not helpful. So I think it has a lot to do with who you go outside to partner with and what you use them for. So I don't think there's a a rule in terms of, going inside or going outside with respect to innovation. In general, the capability has to be within. So I think you need to develop that muscle. But I do think that the consultants can help both at the ground, working on very specific innovation problems, or all the way up to strategy. So, I think the answer really depends on what you're trying to do and achieve. But I can see consultants either being useful or not useful, helping on strategy or the details. Depends.
Teach a man how to fish.
Yeah, but that's the most important thing.
So we have a couple more minutes left. Maybe we should skip some of the other questions that I prepared. There's so much more left. But let's talk about the next week. So Corporate Innovation Conference is just around the corner. And next Wednesday, you're going to be delivering a closing keynote. Could you give us just a small teaser about what you'll talk about next week?
Yeah, thank you. So today was kind of an introduction to systems and mechanisms, and was short on stories and case histories. So for the presentation, I'm going to flip that. I am going to touch on the structure, but really what I'm going to talk about is examples working with Amazon and Apple and Bose and Cisco about where I've seen situations where innovation has really succeeded and where it's failed. So it's a little bit more about lessons learned and war stories.
So a more practical overview.
Exactly.
I would just like to again mention your book, Innovate Products Faster, that is available to purchase on Amazon, as well as your website that has tons of very useful tools and materials that you use with your partners and clients every day. So we see a lot of different tools and methodologies being used in various innovation efforts in different companies. That will be the topic of our conference next week. So how important are these tools to reaching innovation?
They're not the major factors, to be honest, but what they do is they save time and they focus your efforts on what matters, so that they're like great efficiency improvers as opposed to innovation drivers themselves. I'd say as a generalization. They're good, they're useful, but you need to lock the secrets of innovation from your mind.
Thank you so much. Thank you again for a great and insightful talk. We are all very eager to see you next week at our Corporate Innovation Conference. So that's next Wednesday. And I think that our attendees are really happy with the presentation and the answers. I can see a lot of praises coming in from the chat.
Great. Oh, I was delighted to be part of this evening.
Thank you once again. Have a lovely day. And to our attendees who have not yet registered, I'm inviting you to do so by visiting our website, corporateinnovation.rs, where we prepared an action-packed afternoon filled with deep insights on concrete methodologies and tools used for successful innovation processes. Thank you for your attention.